here. Mr. White, Chair White is not here today. I'll be chairing today's Ordinance Committee meeting. So we'll convene the Ordinance Committee meeting of October 12th, 2010. We're going to be talking about Sign Committee reconstitution and ordinance revisions. Mr. Lamone, want to get us started?
Council members, today we're here to give you a presentation on the proposed Sign Committee reconstitution proposal, as well as amendments to improve sign enforcement. The overview today is broken up in sections, so I'm going to be beginning the presentations, and my associate Joanne LeConte will be focusing on the issue of sign enforcement and give you examples of the enforcement issues that are out in the city and how we plan to change and tweak some of the amendments that are being proposed today, the sign regulations, to address those issues. Then I'll return back and complete the proposed amendments with some discussion on changes that we're trying to attempt to deal with expiration of time approvals and time extensions. And then we also have a change related to that with respect to the terminology that we use for preliminary approvals. We believe that at this time it would make sense to change the term preliminary approval to project design approval, and I'll get a little bit more into information on why we're proposing to do that. And then we'll complete the presentation with some proposed changes to the zoning information report requirements. So we'll begin the presentation now. Okay,
just before you do, for those of you who want to speak, I think some of you already have figured it out, but there's a speaker slip in the back. If you'll take a minute to fill it out and turn it in up here to Lori at the front desk. And then I understood there was at least one person that wanted to have more than the typical 2 minutes, and if that's so, then others who are present, it'd be okay if you give that person your time, but you need to turn in a speaker slip as well. So that's how we'll work it when we get down to the other end. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, to begin the presentation, I think it's important to understand sort of the background on why these proposals are coming forward at this time. Obviously, the City Council has been dealing with the budget and the cutbacks to our Department and Planning Division and the reduced staffing levels. And as a result of those staffing level reductions, we've embarked on conversations with our applicants and our board members to try to look at trying to improve efficiencies. And we had a series of meetings with our board members primarily to brainstorm on ideas of what can we do differently that would achieve some type of savings, but either with staff time and or actual associated work efforts, and how can we also improve efficiencies. So that primarily set forward a list of ideas that we selected, and one happens to be the idea of the sign committee. How can we staff the sign committee and take advantage of existing meetings that occur already? The sign committee did in fact have its own meeting date. They met individually as a committee on separate, and it does take staff time to prepare that agenda and to staff that committee. We believe we have a proposal today that will explain that we'll be able to take advantage of existing design review staffing and the meetings that occur already, where the meetings are already set up. And we just merely have these sign committees take place in more of a consent calendar review process. We also have ideas to try to improve sign enforcement, because the ability of and effectiveness of our sign committee really it goes hand in hand with how effective we are to enforce all the regulations and to maintain the approvals and to track all these types of signage installations throughout the city. So obviously when we have a discussion with the sign committee, they are always adamant that we try to maintain that sign level of enforcement, because once we start lowering that level of enforcement, you see a deterioration of signage, and then everyone starts placing out prohibited type signs, and it gets out of control. So we have proposed a improvement, we believe, that involves dedicating some sign enforcement staff that used to actually staff the sign committee to do sign enforcement. So we believe this is a good proposal. We also have, again, some changes that we believe will reduce the staff time in dealing with all the types of extension requests that come forward as a result of just the time involved in going through our city process. in these requests. So we believe that we've improved that provision in our ordinance, and we'll get into the actual language later on. And again, the Association of Realtors have been in with discussions with us on proposed changes and how to improve how we deal with their real estate signs and the problems associated with where they place these signs. And we believe we've worked out an agreement where we can agree on how having some guidelines that are in place that establish where these signs go and not have to actually over-regulate them and list it all in the ordinance provisions. So we're going to propose that today. With respect to the sign committee reconstitution, there was ongoing discussions with the sign committee on what could we do differently, and it was actually staff's idea to try to establish a consent calendar. If some of you are been around for a while, the sign committee actually had a consent calendar about 15 years ago, and we went into a conforming review to try to do a more expedited review process where we could actually have signs reviewed every week. And for the last 15 years, that has actually worked very effectively. The sign committee meets every 2 weeks, and they could refer projects to this conforming review. Well, our proposal today is to maintain that conforming review, so a weekly review still occurs, but sort of dividing the responsibility with the 4 members that would remain on the sign committee, where we'd have specific members dedicated to review signs that would be subject to EPV requirements. So we have 2 members associated with that review at a consent calendar. And then the other signs outside El Pueblo Viejo district would be reviewed by another 2 set members of the sign committee. So we think that's an effective way to still get the detailed review, because most of these sign committee members have been around for a while, so they're very good at picking up on that type of review process. And in effect, we have had a trial to this point version of that review process, because we've actually implemented it as of August. And Louise Boucher is here. She's going to be commenting today on our ordinance amendments, and she could speak to you also on, I believe, her belief that it is working effectively. But she has cautioned me that she believes it should be a temporary change, and that we would be looking forward in the future, if our activity picks up and the types of applications do increase, that we may have to go back to our full committee review, because the consent calendar can only take so much items, or else it starts conflicting with other consent reviews. And we also have an issue with the volunteers, how much time they have also to review these applications on specific dates. So one of the changes that we're going to also propose is that major sign applications would be most likely automatically referred to the full ABR and the HLC. Some of the workload volume is actually down right now for design review applications, so we feel that they could absorb these type of applications. So I think that's the proposal today that we have to do that. We'd like to keep the sign committee still in existence and just reconstitute the memberships. This is, again, the outline of how we've begun the process already, and we think it's working effectively. With respect to sign regulations, I'm going to turn this part of the presentation over to Joanne LeConte, who has a lot of years' experience dealing with enforcement issues, and she'll walk you through those sign amendments.
Okay, Ms. LeConte.
Good afternoon.
Okay, you can start with that one. No, you can probably start with that.
The purpose one of the purposes why we're here today is to discuss the amendments to the sign ordinance. And some of the reasons for the changes is new technology and terminology since we last updated the sign ordinance. There are many different types of signs that didn't originally exist when we implemented a sign ordinance. Another is to revise the language for exemptions to not be as vague, so it's specific and we can point to it, and we don't have to explain it so much. It's a clarification for both the businesses and for the enforcement staff, so they can clearly tell someone what we're trying to regulate and what it means, and be a little bit more specific than the language we have today. These are some examples of signs that we deal with commonly when we do a sign enforcement. And one of the first steps that we look at when we're doing the sign enforcement are these signs illegal or exempt from the ordinance requirements? So this is a small variety of the signs. We have definitions that define what is a sign and how do we regulate them? And so some of the current definitions deal with signs that move, rotate, but they're not really clear. What does that mean? So while some of these signs, like the large inflatable sign, may be regulated under that section today, it's not clearly defined as a balloon or a large inflatable sign. So our intention is to change some of those definitions so we can clearly state what we're trying to prohibit, exempt, or allow through a permit process. The ordinance has a section that for exempt signs, and that is a quite lengthy section, but a lot of the exemptions relate to government signs that are required by law, temporary constructions. What do we do when we have a construction site? We have a need for signs. How do we identify a building? How do we direct traffic from parking lots? What do we do when we have civic events? So they are meant to kind of not regulate so much that allow for these things to be displayed for specific periods of time without having to get a sign permit. We also have a section in the ordinance that prohibits many signs. So this is a small sampling of those type of signs. For instance, we don't allow additional signage on the phone booths that advertise a product that's not part of the phone itself and what that function is of the phone booth. And the portable signs, other than real estate signs, are prohibited, as well as banners and the DVD where they're advertising different types of movies.
Excuse me, could you explain the DVD violation there? I didn't get that.
The DVD is an outdoor vending machine, and they're limited on the signage that they can provide. They are also regulated through the sign ordinance, and they are regulated through the sign committee and limit the amount of signage that would be.
So we're looking at, what's the violation here? I'm not sure I understand.
They're advertising a variety of movies, and they have...
Mr. Hotchkiss?
Yeah.
This was actually an installation that was installed in all the 7-Eleven stores in the city without approvals. And what we asked them to do is go through our permit process for outdoor vending, and they elected to remove these as a result of our enforcement. So they are prohibited as an outdoor.
Yeah, but just clarify for me and the audience, what is actually wrong here? They're just not supposed to have stuff outside, selling stuff outside?
There are two provisions. There are specifically ordinance amendments that we came to council about 7 years ago where we regulate outdoor vending machines, primarily intended because businesses were placing them everywhere with a lot of associated signage. Okay. So now we have a permitting process. So this applicant could have come forward and requested a permit, but they chose to eliminate them.
So with a permit, this might have been okay?
There might be some screening requirements or some limits on the actual lettering, as Ms. LaConte says. There's specific guidelines with respect to what the sign committee would
big
review,
and all
how big and how much you could have.
Thank you.
Can I just follow up? So if they went through a permit, would they have received a permit for that example right there, or would that not have fit through the sign guidelines?
Most likely not, because most of our standards do speak to trying to limit the visual clutter of these installations. And there's actually a standard that we would like to have them either recessed into a building facade or have some type of screening where they fit nicely into it. So we dealt with outdoor water vending machines, for example, throughout the city. And in some cases, they've been screened on each side to actually fit into the site much better in an improved manner.
Okay, thank you.
So as part of the revisions, we're proposing to add a definition for inflatable signs. They're not specifically, they don't have a specific definition in the ordinance today, so we just want to clarify what that means. So that's one of the proposals for a change. Another new type of sign that you didn't see when we first adopted the ordinance were signs that are projected onto buildings from an alternate light source. While the sign ordinance does currently say that if a sign is not exempt, it requires a permit, so therefore this would require a permit, it doesn't speak about projected signs. It doesn't speak to that in the ordinance, so we're trying to incorporate this new technology into the definitions. These are a couple of different types of signs projected on buildings. These are examples of inflatable signs used in various ways to call attention to a business. These are video display signs. Our current ordinance does prohibit changeable copy signs, signs that change, as well as signs that rotate, move. There are prohibitions in our ordinance today, but it doesn't specifically talk about a digital display. So by adding a definition, this would make it easier for people to understand that that also is incorporated. Ground signs. We currently do define ground signs in the ordinance, and while it limits the height of a ground sign to 6 feet, there is not language in there that talks about the supporting structure. So if you see the columns to the left on the one sign for the on the left-hand side, you'll see sometimes the columns can extend above the sign face, and while it was always meant that that would be included in the maximum height, it didn't clarify that, so we're adding that language so it's clearer to the applicant that when they're proposing a ground sign, it includes that the support structure cannot exceed the height limitation of 6 feet, and it also talks about mounding when they provide an artificial grade and where that is measured from. Signs in open bays. When there's an exemption in the ordinance for window signs, that it's kind of meant to provide signage on a temporary basis when you're having a sale. It limits the size, and it doesn't allow those signs to be in the form of a banner. When they developed the sign ordinance, people weren't thinking that this provision would be used for open bay, so trying to change that provision so we deal with the scenario of an open bay is not exactly a window sign, and anything within that bay would be regulated within a certain proximity to the opening of the bay. These are additional signs of open bay signs, photographs. Gasoline pump signs. The current ordinance talks about signs on gasoline pumps, and it exempts them if they only identify the product being sold. So if it was a telephone booth, it would be the telephone. If it was a gasoline sign, it would only identify gasoline, and it would only provide for the operating instructions, and that those letter heights would be limited to 2-inch letter heights. However, people are using the gasoline pump signs to advertise additional products. As you see in some of these examples, they are advertising things that they might sell in the store. And so this is further saying that these aren't something that is provided for in the exemption. For sale, rent, or lease signs, the current ordinance has an exemption for sale, rent, or lease signs. However, it limits the location and the height of those signs to the size of the height of a ground sign, which is 6 feet. So, and there are other provisions within the ordinance that don't let them interfere with an architectural feature, but they're in different sections. So we want to kind of identify more clearly in the section that exempts them that it can't exceed 6 feet in height, because that's the size of a ground sign. Right now, it just says it can't exceed the height of a ground sign. So we just want to add that language, so they don't have to look for it in an
Repeat
alternate
that, about 6
location.
feet. Say that again.
Well, the way that the ground sign definition says it can't exceed 6 feet in height. When you look to the exemption, it just says it can't exceed the height of a ground sign, but it doesn't say what that height is.
Thank you.
Oh, and here another example of for sale, rent, and lease signs. This would be an unacceptable location. It is higher than 6 feet in height, and this was not the proposed purpose of this exemption. Here are different examples of how people are displaying these signs in different locations. So we're just trying to clarify that section to make it clearer for people.
So which of those two examples, if either, are acceptable?
No.
Well, if the example on the left, if it did not exceed 6 feet in height, that would be acceptable, even if it was 4 square feet. So if it was higher than that, then it would not be allowed.
Councilman Hotchkiss, I also want to clarify in this section that there was essentially a compromise. We said let's allow a slight increase from 3 square feet to 4 square feet for these, but we're going to reemphasize that they are to be placed at the ground. And unfortunately, we've had most of those folks want to have better visibility, and they start getting higher and higher on buildings.
There's another section of the ordinance that exempts real estate signs if they're in certain location and a certain number. It does not allow for them to be in the right-of-way currently. So we're looking at adding a provision that might consider areas where it would be appropriate to allow it in the right-of-way, but they're going to work with the Board of Realtors and staff to come up with guidelines to determine when that would be appropriate, and, to ensure that you don't have a site visibility problem or the potential for an accident. So that's something that we're going to revise to kind of work with the realtors to establish something that would meet the safety criteria and their needs to display the sign.
If I could just further clarify Ms. Malacante's comments, the proposal would not be to allow these types of for sale signs in the right of way. We are going to again reemphasize that they're not allowed, but the concession would be to discuss with the association how many open house signs they could have. And I believe that today they have a proposal to increase what's allowed right now for 3 off-site signage, open house signs. So the agreement is really based on trying to develop guidelines where we want these open house for signs, not to allow these in the right of way. We're not proposing that.
Yeah, so this is going to be a big issue.
No, but let me, if I can clarify,
I think there's going to
Mr.
be a big issue.
No, the clarification would be the number of open house signs.
Right.
It's always been very clear with the Association of Realtors that they could not encroach into the sidewalks. That this has been a recent phenomena over the last several years where, due to lack of enforcement, we've seen them crop up more and more into the right-of-way, but they were never allowed.
Right. Well, what I'm suggesting is that might be up for reconsideration, because there's some places where you would not be able to post a for sale sign, which is not going to make our constituents very happy when they come to sell their house. So just
Chair
let
House?
you know about that.
Yes,
We're aware that there are a variety of situations that exist, but I want to make clear that in this picture you're being shown, there is an appropriate alternative location for this sign on the private property. And so we want to make it really clear that the posting of the for sale sign, the one that remains up for weeks or months on the property that's for sale, is not appropriate in the right of way. We also want to have exemptions and allowances for the fact that open house signs really do most effectively work in the right-of-way. That is where the realtors use them now. The code does not allow it. So whenever you see those, they're technically illegal, and we think that they should be legal. We think that the city can develop, in cooperation with the Board of Realtors, a sign standard that fits the need. But in this case, so just so the committee's aware, there are distinctions. There's 2 different types of signs. There's the for sale sign, and then there's the open house sign. And in most instances that we've been observing, the for sale sign really can work somewhere on the private property that is for sale.
Okay, so as the sort of the rhythm of the presentation here, you're covering the different territory right now that's been considered, and it's as part of the proposals. You haven't been giving us many value judgments as to whether what we're seeing is acceptable or not, or what the change will be. So will you be giving we have all read this, but really helping us identify where those kinds of changes will be made, because certainly some of them may be fighting words and some of them might be just fine. So will you do that for us and give us a little bit more detail of which way things are going to be going?
Councilman House, I think there are going to be speakers speaking on this issue, and we'll delve into the language.
Well, I think the actual proposal that we're going to be making, that you're making today for us to consider, it's important that you let us know which way things are going somewhere
Sure.
in the conversation.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay.
Mr. Hotchkiss, and then we should let them continue.
I think we did get a value judgment on this, and it was that it doesn't belong there, and I wouldn't disagree. But if you went back to that last picture, and the hedge on the property came right up to the sidewalk, which it's allowed to do, there's not going to be any place to put that for sale sign if it's not going to be higher than 6 feet. So I think we need to look at this pretty carefully and not just make a blanket statement of, no, we're not going to do it unless there are gross exceptions. Anyway, that's a matter for debate down the line.
Okay, we'll hold that for discussion, and why don't you go ahead and continue with the presentation then? So
in this example, the sign on the left would be the one that would be placed on the property. It says one sign is allowed on the property that's for sale at all times. Then it talks about additional signs for directional. So if you're looking for an open house, that would be the sign on the right. You would have those leading up to the sign and to the open house so you could see how to get there. So I'm looking for an open house sign. I know there's an open house in this neighborhood. So I'm looking for those signs to direct me, and those are the signs that we're speaking of that would be more considered in the right-of-way. Those signs that say, oh, this is how you get to that house. But once you get there, the sign that remains on the property at all times would be the sign to the left, and those are the ones that are generally not prohibited, that are prohibited in the right-of-way today and have been.
Okay.
Another portion of the ordinance that we're trying to address today are flags. And the current ordinance does exempt one flag of a specific size, and so there are recommendations to change that to perhaps 2. So these are different photographs of ways that flags can be displayed throughout the city. The next slide addresses signs with lighting in the windows as well as neon tubing. So there are a variety of situations where people put neon tubing in the windows to surround it or to grab the attention, so people will see their business. So these are just a couple of examples of how neon can be displayed in the window and lighting.
Let me ask you a question. When you say can be displayed, do you mean allowed under the changes that are being proposed, or are you showing us examples of violations? We're having a hard time, I think, up here understanding whether you're showing us current violations that would be remedied by whatever changes might be made, or are the things you're showing us the things that would be approvable under the recommendations?
Well, some of the provisions we're going to discuss today are about neon signs that would be allowed under an exemption, and we'll get to those in a few slides that would deal with primarily open signs. Other aspects of it would be things that would not be allowed, like tubing in the windows to draw attention to the window and the product being displayed that isn't currently addressed in the sign ordinance. And another element would be signs located in the landmark district, El Pueblo Viejo, which does not allow neon signs today in the window. So we would be talking about regulating them or how close to the window they could be before they would be regulated. The current ordinance states that anything within 4 feet of the window is considered a window sign. So, for instance, if you look at the signs on your left, those are in our El Pueblo Viejo landmark district, and they're not set back 4 feet. Those would be regulated and not allowed. If they were 4 feet back from the window area, they would be exempt from regulations today. One of the proposals in that landmark district is to make it 10 feet back, and then they wouldn't be regulated with any, but that's only in that particular district.
Okay.
Then the sign on the right, if it wasn't in a landmark district and it was 4 feet back from the window, wouldn't be regulated. But currently, as it is, it would be regulated because there's lighting in the sign. So there are 2 parts of this. One is dealing with lighting in general, and the second is dealing with neon. So as we proceed throughout the slides, we'll have some more examples.
Okay, Mr. Hotchkiss, do you have a question on that? And then
I'm wondering about I can see problems with the 10-foot or even 4-foot back. I don't know how we discriminate here, but let's say you have a bar, it's got a window on the street, and 4 feet back over the bar it says, I don't know, Budweiser or something, is that now controlled or not, or it would be in the future? In other words, if you just had things for your patrons that happen to be viewable through the window, is it different than if it's not viewable through the window? I'm trying to think in terms of a landowner here or a business owner.
Councilwoman Hotchkiss, let me try to characterize the changes so you understand. And we have not pulled out every ordinance change, so I apologize for that. But the general intent of our presentation is to explain to you some of the enforcement-related issues that the sign committee has identified and would like us to tighten in ability to improve our enforcement. So associated with lighting, with this, for example, on the left here, if you place this type of sign 4 feet back beyond the window, technically under current guideline or current regulations, you could qualify as an exemption. We believe that's a circumvention of the intent. You still see the language that's being displayed at night, and it's clearly in a size of lettering that is intended to be regulated. So in order to close that type of exemptions, we're now suggesting that this type of signage should be regulated with better definitions that say it doesn't matter if it's 4 feet back, it's still going to be reviewed and publicly visible, and therefore should be regulated. So if you think we're taking too much of a jump to try to regulate this type of signage, I suppose you would be supportive of allowing this to be continued. We have sign committee members that believe it's a circumvention of the intent of the ordinance.
Okay, and we'll get a chance to hear from them too today. All right, let's continue on. Let's see what else we've got.
The example on the left is the neon tubing used to draw attention to a business, and this is in a landmark district, and although there's not a sign there, it still draws that attention, and so it states that neon tubing would not be allowed in the windows. Just clarifies that. And the example on the right is are different ways that people use neon to draw attention to a business. So those are what we're trying to prohibit, that they would light up all the windows with the neon tubing.
Thank you.
These are different examples of lighting in windows. There is a provision that states that they're trying to add in a provision that would limit lighting in windows without permits. You can certainly apply for a permit to have lighting in the window, but it would require review and approval by the sign committee. These are examples of temporary holiday lighting that is left up all year long. So there is current provision that allows the lighting to be temporary during the holiday and removed within 10 days. But they're left all year long on the building to continue to draw attention to.
I also want to comment on that there's a provision that defines a holiday to be one recognized by the city. And so it is, one could argue that there's a holiday every week of the year, and we're tightening that up to say, it's got to be a recognized holiday.
I saw solstice was listed in the
Yes.
staff report
Yes.
as an example. Okay.
There's a current provision in the ordinance that exempts open and closed signs, and it goes further to exempt many things, but the exemption is to only allow one open or closed sign, 2-inch letter height, maximum size of 5 square feet. It did not provide an exemption to allow an illuminated or neon open sign. And this has been a point of contention for enforcement. It's very hard. There are many neon open signs throughout the city, and it was very hard to regulate. And it's common to have a neon open sign. So the proposal is to allow an exemption for a neon open sign, and except in our El Pueblo Viejo Landmark District where we do not allow neon signs. So the exemption, these are just a few examples of the different types of neon open signs, and as I go through the slides, you'll see different letter heights in the open signs and different sizes. So we'll be talking about two things. One is the size of the letter. So if you look at these neon signs, the O would be what's the maximum letter height of that O. And then what is the maximum size if you can include the framing around the sign. So those are the two areas we're trying to talk about. So the open sign on the left has a maximum letter height of 8 inches, and the sign frame is 14 inches. And that is, we believe the recommendation is that that is too large, and we were going to go for something more between a 6 to 8 inch letter height for the letter of the sign, and an overall 12-inch size of the sign. Now, the staff report calls out different dimensions, but in consultation with the sign committee, they clarified that their recommendation was the 6 to 8 inch letter height with an overall size of not more than 12. So these are just two different examples of those. The sign, these two represent what we would like to see in the exemption. The letter height on one is 4 inches, and the maximum size is 6, and the other is a 6-inch sign, 6-inch letter height with a maximum 12-inch overall height, and that's the recommendation for the exemption. So this slide clarifies a little bit more what the proposed text is, and as I stated before, the staff report that was the report that you received recommended the 12 inches in the overall height, not to exceed 14 inches, but talking to the sign committee, it was really a proposal for 6 to 8 inch letter height and an overall 10 to 12 inch maximum size sign. And they would not be allowed in El Pueblo Viejo, and they could not flash or blink. There's another exemption in the ordinance that well, it's not an exemption, it's a standard for the El Pueblo Viejo guidelines. And the standard says, this is what we'd like to see, and this is what acceptable. We will allow a no vacancy sign to be neon, and that letter height currently is called out as the maximum 3-inch letter height, and the proposal is to expand that to 4 inches. So that concludes this portion of the presentation. We'd like to refer it back to Mr. Limon to complete the presentation, and when we're finished with the entire presentation, we would like to entertain any questions that anyone has.
Okay, thank you. And I think just a quick comment. I think that one of the things that's a little difficult in the presentation is to still to know the distinctions between what we have now and what's being proposed. So the degree to which you can help us with that. This is now regarding this section that we just talked about. That will be helpful in our discussion. Mr. Limon?
Mr. Chair, I think I would probably recommend that if you want to get to that detail level, that would be best that we make a different type of presentation to explain that more clearly. Today's emphasis was try to have you understand that the sign committee would like some improved enforcement measures in our ordinance. And so if you think there's a need for additional discussion on these sign ordinance amendments,
okay,
it's okay to continue that, and we'll have that discussion in detail on the actual specifics.
Thanks. Maybe there'll just be certain specific ones that we have issues with and want to get some more discussion on, like we were just talking about.
Again, our primary interest is to have the sign committee reconstitution move forward. That's really critical that we try to get that adopted by City Council, as well as these other two items that we're trying to
approvals,
improve.
time extensions.
Yes,
and the rest.
I'll quickly go over that to conclude our presentation. So, with respect to expiration of approvals and time extensions, this is another idea that staff focused in on with respect to the time and efforts that is expended by staff to try to track time approvals. Right now, you have a lot of applications that come forward through our review process, and during the course of, in some cases, several years, the applicant is expected to track the various approvals that they obtain. Well, sometimes we're not very proactive in alerting them on these expiration dates, and they get trapped into either a need to get a reapproval before our boards and commissions, or having to ask for multiple extensions. We think it's more of a confusing process. We'd like to simplify that approach by indicating to them that there's a specific set period of time that you have, and all you have to do is track that one date, whether it's a ABR approval that's with a specific time frame that would allow one extension. You don't have to worry about asking for 2 or 3 extensions. We think that extension provision would allow these to be maintained and their entitlements to be maintained within a set period of time. So our proposal would be to allow 3 years from the time they obtained an approval to the time they get a building permit. We think that's sufficient time from what we now call preliminary approval for them to go get their final and get a building permit. And if they would like to have more time, we would give them a 2-year extension on that time. So essentially 5 years. We think that's sufficient. And not place them before another review process again, before the review boards, where we may have a different review board with different composition wanting to come up with a different decision. We think that's a difficult situation to put an applicant through. So that's our proposal with respect to our design review approvals. The other provision that would also clarify things is when you have a zoning modification, for example, an approval, often that expires before your design review approval, or vice versa. You have a land use approval that's still valid, but your design review approval expires. What we would like to propose is to have those extensions run with the longest land use discretionary approval. So if you have a zoning modification, you keep your zoning modification approval valid and current, and that's your expiration date. That's the one that dictates, we don't place you through another design review approval decision. It's your land use entitlement. So we think those are two valid proposals that will save staff time and also lessen confusion. And the last change as we go forward and revise this section is the idea of a project or a preliminary approval decision and what that means. We have had applicants continue to come forward and say, I was unaware that the preliminary approval should have been the step that we've, or the decision point that appeal should have been filed. It's very confusing to what preliminary means, and I took the liberty of looking up in Webster's that it indicates preliminary means that denoting an action or event proceeding or in preparation for something more important. Well, we're saying preliminary approvals are the most important decision point, so it is confusing for folks. So what our proposal now is to change the definition terminology from preliminary to project design approval. So folks understand that that's the time if you need to appeal something, a decision from our boards, that would be the time. So preliminary approval magically becomes project design approvals under the change in terminology. And we think, again, it'll reduce confusion. It'll be something that we can incorporate on our agendas, our handouts and guidelines, and make sure that folks understand that that's a very critical step. And what we expect our boards to do when they make an action, take an action is, for example, I've given you some language where they state project design approval with an indefinite continuous to full board for review of final colors, details, and landscape plan. Fairly clear definition there that says the approval has been granted, and we're just going to speak about these final details now at the next level. So that's our proposal. I'm sorry. And then the last change is with respect to zoning information reports, and I think the Association of Realtors have also been informed of this proposal, which would also make zoning information reports for condominiums optional. We believe that those don't present the type of violations that typically come up with a single-family residence, and therefore our change is to allow that to be an optional requirement. We've also recently discovered, and this is why it's outlined in red, that due to the recent T-Fire home reconstructions, that the ordinance provisions require that a zoning information report still be prepared even for properties during construction timeframes, or that a certificate of occupancy has just recently been completed. We think that there's another provision that we could add that would exempt these property owners from this requirement if we've recently inspected the properties. So those are the two changes that we would also offer at this time to be included as our proposal. So that concludes our presentation. We're now open for questions. We also have Renee Brook here available for any questions on zoning enforcement related matters.
Very good. And I see we have one member of HLC who's also on the sign committee, Louise Boucher. Is there anyone else from sign committee, HAB? Okay. And we'll have the two of you come up right now, if you would, please. And just, if it would be all right, and address us, because if you wanted to, you don't have to. But if you want to, this is a good time to do it. Yes, Ms. Schneider.
Thank
Mayor
you, Mr.
Schneider.
Chair. That's all right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, just a point of process, it seems like there are two major components here, one that seems easy to move forward and one that's going to be a lot more complicated to move forward. And I don't know if we want to separate those out, because like you said, there's the way to expedite some of it, meaning the change in terminology, the structure of the committee, the process involved, those kind of things. I think I really don't really have any problems, and it makes a lot of sense based on the rationale behind, like what your report said. The sign stuff, what's exempted, what's permitted, what's not permitted, that's going to be a whole much bigger conversation. So I'm wondering if, in terms of, given it's 20 after 1, there's a lot of speakers and I imagine a lot of the comments are going to have to be dealing with the more detailed stuff. Do we want to separate those things out? Can we do that? Just so then you can bring something to council that may seem like the no-brainer stuff, and then the other more detailed items, the ordinance committee can take its time and get it done right.
Let's take this this way. We've got 4. I listed 5 things. There's the sign committee reconstitution. Sure. We've got them up there. Okay, good. There you are. And so there's 4 of them that are in one kind of group, as Mayor Schneider was just saying, and then there's one, the sign regulations, which I think are going to really take us a different kind of time. Now, today we have a number of speakers, and I want to make sure we really get a chance to hear from everybody, but that might help us sort of identify areas of real interest for the subsequent conversation. Would that be all right? And we could, if we have time today, we can take up those other 4. If not, we may have to do that on the next time as well.
Well,
Yes,
Mr. Chair,
please.
I was suggesting if we're okay with the 4,
Sure.
that we move it forward.
We could, very
and
well.
then have the more detailed stuff hear from the public, but certainly that's probably going to be continued on to another time. But then that way you can move forward and bring those items to council sooner, as opposed to keeping them to last.
Is that okay with you, Mr. Lamone, and staff?
Yes.
Please? No? Okay, good. All right. You good? Good with that?
No, I agree. I think that the signage specifics take a lot of close examination, and we don't want to do that now. But the timing and the proposed name changes all make absolute sense.
Great. And for those who are here to speak, that doesn't hold you back from commenting on any of this. In fact, it'll help us a lot when we try to figure out how we're going to organize our time for the next meeting. Okay, Ms. Boucher.
Subcommittee? Are you a subcommittee?
The Ordinance Committee,
Ordinance
Charter Committee.
Okay. Pardon me. Yeah, I go way back with signs, and I'm very pleased with how they worked out in this community. I think it's part of the whole thing of Santa Barbara having its own sense of place. And people comment, what is it about Santa Barbara? And one of the main things is that the signage is so well done, and it's fair for everyone, okay? To speak on the subject of the committee changes, I think it's working well now. We tend to get 2 every 2 weeks, and that works fine. And as long as we're in this particular state of economy that we're in now, I think it works. But I would be very worried that somehow it got slipped in as a permanent thing and not returned to the full committee when things improve. On sign height, I think it's interesting to know that the freeway signs are 6 inches high. If you're talking about, open signs and so forth, that you read the freeway signs perfectly well at 6 inches in a moving car. So that's just one of the things I would bring up when we get into this a little farther. But in the meantime, don't make this permanent. It's working, and I hope things improve. I'm sure they will shortly. Thank you.
Good. Keep the faith. Very good. And yes, ma'am. If you come up, and it's Natalie. Yes, nice to see you, Natalie Cole.
Cope. And I just wanted to just briefly say again, I agree with the situation that we have right now, having our reduced committee, and we have 4 members that have been on the committee for quite a while now, so it works well. However, terms will come up, and if we get new people in the situation, it may not work as well. So I would also like to have this just as a temporary situation and go back to the full board when possible. I would also like to say I have reviewed all of the ordinance changes, and at this time I'm in agreement with what's being proposed. So I just wanted to make those comments.
Okay, and thank you for your long service on the committee. Are there any questions for either of the two here from the committee? Okay, great. With that, then, we're going to open up to public comment, and 2 minutes will be your time. If there's some other arrangement, please let me know. The other folks who are sharing time with you or giving the time to you need to be here, and their name should be in this list here. We'll start with Juana Dowell, please, and she'll be followed by Todd Berlinger. So, you are? Okay, very good. Thank you. Come forward then, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Juana Dowell. I'm the Director of Development at the Page Youth Center. We serve hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of children in the area, some of them at risk, some of them not at risk, but we're trying so hard to keep them good. And the Pumpflix has been so helpful in getting our word out to the community. Pumpflix, I see Mr. Hotchkiss has a questioning look on his face. Oh, okay. Okay, sorry. On the gas station pumps. The little videos, we're able to send those in for free, and they get displayed, and they tell the community about the Page Center and all the good works we do. And it's always such an easy thing to happen, and we really appreciate it.
You're referring to the video displays above the pumps at some of the gas stations?
I am.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, and we'll have, Trish Allen. I'm sorry, I didn't give the next person. Trish Allen, followed by Cresta Schaefer, please.
Thank you. Trish Allen with Suzanne Elledge, Planning and Permitting Services. I am thankfully here not to comment on any of the changes with the sign ordinance. I think you have quite a few comments about that, but I did want to come out as a planner, as a professional working in this city, and come out and voice my support for the time extension changes that staff has put together. It is, even when you're knowledgeable about the system, in terms of the different time limits, it is onerous to keep track of when projects will expire, the different types of applications, and the time it takes to get through a design review process and actually get into the building department and get your permit issued and keep everything active. Staff, consultants, none of us want to redo the good work that went into it the first time, so I'm here to voice my support. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Allen. Okay, Cresta Schaefer, followed by Kyle McClung. Okay, thank you. Then Kyle, McClung, both of you are doing that? Okay, and who are you giving the time to?
Jonathan.
Oh, I see. Oh, Jonathan. Hi, Jonathan King. All right, we'll catch you in just a minute here. We'll see how many more of these you get. We might be here for a while. Lori Cole Alleridge, followed by, Doug Fell.
Hi, I'm Lori Cole Alleridge, and I have a small business here in town, Lori's Mobile Notary and Fingerprinting. And I noticed the videos at the gas station, and I thought it would be an affordable way to advertise my business. So I contacted the owner, and knowing that I was a small business owner, he offered to advertise my business and on his video at the gas stations, which has brought lots of business my way. It's been a great way to advertising, and it's been a tremendous benefit to my small business here in town. So I greatly appreciate the videos on the gas station.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your comment. So, Doug Fell, you're on, and followed by Chris Perizzo, I think that's right.
Hey, Chair House and members of the Ordinance Committee, I feel a little bit like we got filibustered because we've only got 2 minutes or 3 minutes left. But I'm here on behalf of John Price and his company, Pumpflix, which is being running into a problem with the sign ordinance. John has small TV screens on the gas pumps installed at the Shell, as a good example, at the Shell station at the corner of Carrillo and Chapala Street. They've been there for a substantial period of time. These were installed by his company, Pumpflix, that you've heard other people refer to. John has been told that these small screens are prohibited by the city's sign ordinance. Further, there are further proposals that would make them even more likely not to be approved in the new sign ordinance. We've come here today to provide you with information about Pumpflix, to request that the ordinance committee amend the sign ordinance and specifically authorize devices like Pumplix, not special to John Price, but for everyone who provides this kind of service. And with that, I'd like to ask Janatha King to give you a presentation on Pumplix.
Okay, then let's do this. How much time, Jonathan, do you need for your presentation today?
I'm going to do a brief PowerPoint and then we have a little demonstration for you. So
I see. Okay, why don't you just hold on for a minute? I want to catch some other folks here. We've got quite a few here, and I'd rather get them through. And then we're not up against the wall here. We can go until just before the council meeting, so we'll see how much we can accomplish. Is that all right? Okay. So Chris Parizo, is that right? Are you here? Okay. Sean Checketts, yielding time. Oh, my goodness, Jonathan. Okay, you worked this out. Jim Caldwell, Santa Barbara Association of Realtors, followed by Paul Suding, SBAOR as well. Mm-hmm.
Good afternoon.
Hello, Jim.
Councilman House, Councilman Hotchkiss, Mayor Snyder. We presented, as the Board of Realtors, a letter to you relative to numerous things that we basically have a question as far as wording. We will have other speakers to several of these points. Before I go on, I definitely want to compliment staff for working with us for the last year and a half on coming up with the idea of optional zoning for condominiums, which I think will be beneficial for both the city and the Board of Realtors and our mutual clients as far as people selling condominiums. So I'm not going to belabor that any longer. In the wording as far as the IRs, though, we do have the issue as far as where it is currently positioned that any owner or buyer would have to execute an agreement. Before they could execute an agreement for sale, they would have to have a zoning report, or it would be unlawful. Our condition here would be that it would be before the property is sold, not before it could be listed, because the listing issue would be quite troublesome there, basically. The only other issue I'm going to address, and then I'm going to yield to a couple other people, would be the issue as far as our directional signs for open houses. And when we met with staff a couple of weeks ago, we noted at the time that 3 directional signs is limiting and in many cases does not fulfill the need of a realtor who's trying to draw clients to their open house. This would be particularly true like where you were selling something in the area between State and Foothill as an example, and do you place your sign at State or you place it at Foothill? If you make that decision, you're only going to attract from one direction or the other. Whereby if you put one at each direction and then, like using the example of Las Positas or San Roque Road, if you would then come down to something like one of the side streets that goes in either direction, you could then position a sign and then go a couple of more streets and you would have people come directly there, which would give you more than adequate exposure to your property and would not, in our opinion anyway, create any undue stress as far as traffic flow or anything of that nature.
Well, thank you very much.
So,
thank you. And we do have your letter here. Thank you for
yes, please
providing
refer to the letter accordingly.
So as I understand it, you're recommending 5 signs instead of 3?
We had originally proposed 7.
Right.
I would say there's a compromise somewhere between 7 and 3.
Okay.
I think you understand what I'm saying, that 3's...
Oh, yeah, I'm going through this in my head. I'm going, yeah, okay, sure.
Okay?
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Paul Suding, followed by Sue Irwin.
Greetings. After practicing real estate 31 years in the city and also being very involved with the association, this has come to my attention. And I actually have represented properties in the downtown area that have the opportunity to put, I'm going to be speaking on the placement of for sales, the temporary for sale signs in the Parkway. And it is obvious that many properties aren't suitable for putting a sign on the property itself. One example was on Olive Street that we had a listing where the actual grade that the house, single-story house was on was elevated about 3 or 4 feet with a sandstone wall, retaining wall, that would have elevated the sign that additional height. But in this case, there was a hedge all the way up against the sandstone wall. So anyway, it can be very practical or impractical, as the case may be, to put a sign or impossible on the actual property. So Parkway signs seem to be practical and the most obvious place to put a for sale sign if it complies with the other requirements of the law. The open house signs, it's kind of, I think, to anybody that's held an open house, 3 signs is just not enough. 7 signs may be too many, but 5 would be probably optimum. There are certain houses or locations of houses or properties that we've held open that just you can't get to it with 3 signs, so it just becomes virtually impossible to make open house signs functional for that purpose. Then lastly, I'll go back to the zoning information report required disclosure to buyers. And it may be just the wording, but the wording appears to say that the report must be provided to the buyer before a purchase agreement is executed. If that's the intent, then that is very impractical. The way it is right now and the way we've been practicing it since the zoning inspection report has been required is that it's provided to a buyer prior to a close of escrow as a matter of disclosure so that they have that, so the buyer has that to make a informed decision.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sue Irwin, followed by Allison Spear.
Thank you, Mayor and committee members. I'm Sue Irwin with Prudential, and I am basically repeating and I would like to kind of express my own personal opinion with the open house signs, 3 signs is often very limiting, and if someone was relying on signs, they would not be able to find that home. And as a person selling a home, you are asking your agent to show that your property is available for sale in so many ways, and this is one of the major ways. We have a high percentage of sales from signs. On the ZIR for condominiums, I would just like to stress that the condominiums associations themselves have regulations about what people can do with their individual units in the condominiums. And so there is already a regulatory type of situation available there that perhaps the city could just not require those.
All right.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Allison Spear, followed by Eddie Madrigal, please.
Hi, I'm Allison Spann with the...
Sorry, Allison.
No problem. 25 years in real estate. I was president of the Association of Realtors last year. And I'd like to address the issue of the requirement of the ZIR as it's written. You say that it is going to be unlawful for an owner to execute an agreement of sale for residential property to sell a property in the city of Santa Barbara without providing that report to the buyer prior to that agreement being executed. And I'd like to point out that for the city to get that requirement between a buyer and seller in a legal contract sounds very messy to me, and I think the wording, as Paul suggested and as this letter suggests, would be much preferred, that it simply be a requirement to be disclosed to the buyer, the zoning report disclosed to the buyer prior to close of escrow, rather than get between a buyer and a seller in an unlawful way.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask staff a quick question here regarding that?
Sure. Let's just take
when
it
you
quickly,
said
though.
when you said executed, did you mean close of escrow, or did you mean an accepted offer?
Ms. Weiss?
I think Scott Vincent, City Attorney, would like to respond. The practice and the ordinance is at close of escrow, and
Okay.
it wasn't proposed to change.
Right.
But the language is drafted by the City Attorney.
So, Scott, just so you understand, what the realtors are saying is when you get an offer, it's a legal contract, and the way this reads right now, we'd have to have that report in by the time they accepted the offer, which they can't do. It's not a good idea. But what you mean, or what they hope you mean, is that it's close of escrow.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, the way the ordinance is currently written, the term agreement of sale is actually a defined term. It is the agreement of sale, but and as far as the close of escrow, actually the current ordinance is written that not later than 5 days after entering into an agreement of sale, the notice must be provided to the buyer. So in practice, we're already not following the ordinance. Okay, so I've heard the comments. If the committee wants to assign this to a different period of time as far as the provision of this report, that, we can consider that, and I think that the community development staff may have comments about that as well. But just so that everybody is clear on what the ordinance currently says, the notice is supposed to be provided to the buyer within 5 days of the execution of the agreement of sale, and that can change.
Okay, and at this point, there's no proposed change to the language, so if we take these comments and want to do something with it, we would have to let you know. Yes, Ms. Schneider?
What's the intent behind 5 days versus close of escrow? Like, why does the city care one way or another?
Chair House, and
Yes.
sorry to interrupt before Mr. Vincent responds. Page 27 of your draft ordinance has two sections that we're talking about here. The application is to be made within 5 days of an agreement of sale. And we've definitely spoken with the realtor community about this. We would love to have the application made as soon as possible once the property is put on the market. If you look down at the bottom of that page, copy to buyer, the owner's representative or the owner is to provide a copy no later than 3 days prior to the consummation of the transfer. And I do believe that the standard forms that the real estate community here uses has a place to write in these days, consistent with the ordinance, that they would get it, apply for the report within 5 days and provide it at least 3 days prior to the consummation of the transfer of title.
So 3 days before transfer of title is the way that it is currently.
And that, Mr. Chair, I misspoke. That's the transfer of title. That's commonly referred to as the close of escrow.
So that's the requirement. It would be good then if we get comments that address that would help us understand how that works for the realtors and such. Yes?
And I've got one.
Okay.
That people now, because the expense is considerable for a zoning report, reluctantly, particularly if they're on a very limited budget and have to sell their house, do not want to undergo the expense in advance of getting an accepted contract of asking for a zoning report. So they wait until they get an accepted offer and then apply for a zoning report, as is allowed, as opposed to what we're saying now. The minute you put it on the market, ask for the report. And that, actually, I think, would depress our listing somewhat because people are going to be reluctant to do that.
Let's get back to public comment and move on. This is helpful. Eddie Madrigal, followed by John Nisbet.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Eddie Madrigal. I'm with Pacific Coast Realty, a member of the Santa Barbara Association of Realtors. I have a couple different comments to make. One is on the open house signs, basically directional signs for us. Example, I have a couple listings right now, and using 3 to try and get to the property from a thoroughfare is just really, you cannot do it. You cannot do it. Basically, I've had some people can't find the property trying to adhere to this a couple times and experimenting with this rule. So my proposal is that if we can have a minimum of 5 available to us, I think that would suffice. My second question, as a property owner also, and in the future looking to sell my property, and the inability to put a for sale sign in the right of way instead of your property, it really hurts the process for a couple different reasons. It's just not. I feel it's not safe enough to just put a for sale sign property for sale sign on your property and to have somebody go by and drive by and really crane their neck to see a sign. The other thing is that it takes away from the impression of the property that by just cluttering up with a sign on somebody's personal property. So I'm kind of pushing to allow for sale signs in the open access. So
Okay, we got it. Thank you. John Nisbet, followed by Jonathan King.
Hi, John Nisbet. I'm the executive officer at the Santa Barbara Association of Realtors. I won't repeat everything everybody said. I think it's safe to say, one, the realtors would really like to at least discuss, but to get some way that they can put their for sale signs, the permanent, temporary/permanent for sale signs in the parkways, at least with some properties, because it's so difficult to put them on the property themselves. So that's one issue that we want to work on with the city. The other is, I'm not sure if I misheard or what, but I think that the idea that open house signs are not allowed in public right-of-way, I'm not sure that I would agree based on my reading of the ordinance. So, yeah, so I heard that differently, but I'm glad to hear you agree that they are. Lastly, there's this idea, and nobody's brought this up yet, about somehow referring to guidelines in the ordinance, that the ordinance would be, or signs would be somehow placed with, in relation to the guidelines put out by the Community Development Department or the Public Works Department. And while I think Paul Casey's a swell fella, right now, and I don't know who's coming next, and I think that we really wouldn't be comfortable with that. I think if you want to put limitations or restrictions, do it in the ordinance, or not, the way it is now, but don't allow the arbitrary whim of a department or whatever to somehow later change the way this thing's, the way it's managed. So either put it in the ordinance, leave it out, but the idea that guidelines will then somehow have a secondary rule over the way signs are placed is, I think, problematic for us. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And maybe not now, but when we get back around to it, staff can address the relationship of guidelines to the ordinance. We need to get the rest of the public comment at this time.
Yes, and we'll also want to point out sections of the code that don't allow any signs in right-of-way, including open house signs at present. So we'll review the ordinance with you on that.
I think what we're learning from our conversation are things that we really need to focus on in the next meeting. And Jonathan, I want to make a request. I have enough speakers that will fill up the last bit of time we have before we're done today. I want to give you a chance to speak, and also we do have a chance at the subsequent meeting where we're going to be getting into the specifics about the different kinds of signs. So I'm reticent to, we could do a 6 or 7 minute presentation right now, but I'm afraid that would keep a number of others from speaking. So could you maybe give us a summary right now, and would you be willing to bring your presentation back at the next one where we could allow enough time for that?
I'd be happy to bring it back. My only question.
Come on up, please. Please. And so we get this on the mic.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I'd be happy to bring it back. My only question would be, do the other individuals who have relinquished their time have to come back again? Because, of course, that
No, and I'm making that arrangement right now for you.
Okay.
Is that okay?
That would be fine.
All right, very good. Do you want to give us a quick summary of your comments right now, or do you want to wait until the next
It's
meeting?
probably better to do it with the PowerPoint presentation and show you everything at once.
Well, thank you. That's very gracious, and we'll make sure to arrange for that for the next meeting. Elaine Abercrombie, followed by Toby Bradley.
Hello, Chair and Council members. Thank you so much for hearing me. Elaine Abercrombie, I'm the President of the Association of Realtors. You have all of our concerns, and we represent 1,400 working people in our community, and we hope you'll consider our changes that we'd like to make.
Great, thank you, and thanks again for your letter. That helped us really get it. Toby Bradley, followed by John Perkin.
I haven't seen you people for a while. I'm with the Santa Barbara Association of Realtors also, and I want to speak to one of the issues that has been spoken about, and I'm feeling pretty positive that you're understanding close of escrow and acceptance of contracts and things like that, because I hadn't intended to be here until I saw what was in on that one, and I really panicked about what seemed to be being said. And I think that you're getting clear that the zoning reports have been needed to be, approved and presented to the buyer before the close of escrow. And if that continues, that's fine. We're okay with that. We're absolutely delighted about the condo situation. I've done real estate for 30 years. I've never had a zoning violation in a condo the whole time I've done it, so I think that's going to be very useful. But I did want to say one other thing. Since we're dealing with this issue, the question of ordering those reports even and the 5 days really is an issue right now that wasn't true before there were short sales and REOs. The short sales particularly. I'm in the middle of one right now. Back when we had 30-day escrows, 45-day escrows, whatever, and a lot of them closed. I mean, some of them fell apart. It made some sense to say, order it right away. Also, you had enough people in the zoning department that if somebody forgot to order it right away, you normally still got it done in time. But we now have this perfect storm going on. You really don't have a lot of staff. It may be better after the condos are taken out of it. So it's hard to ask you to let us apply for the zoning reports later, but we have a problem in that when you put an offer in on a short sale, you have no idea if that offer, A, is ever going to close, when that offer is going to close, what the bank's going to do, and therefore you really don't have an accepted offer. We all work that way. The accepted offer is contingent on the approval of the short sale lender. And I would like to propose that that's the date you use for ordering a zoning report if there is something like a short sale. If you don't want to get that particular about it and put it in an ordinance, allow that. Because otherwise, you're forcing people to order zoning reports on deals that may never close. These people are already under water and in a messy situation. And frankly, you're having a lot of people just violate that because in all good conscience, they can't ask their sellers to do that when they really don't think they have a deal, when the lender is still deciding what they'll pay for. So I do think this whole question of the timing of zoning reports and what gets done is really, really important, and it's particularly important right now because of this very murky and messy market. So I hope you'd look at that a lot more carefully.
A quick question for you. So, but just prior to the close of escrow, as we have 3 days. It's 3 days, right? That's would sort of wrap all that in, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think that the problem we've had is that since that 5-day provision is in there, if you don't order it within the 5 days, the zoning department has said you violated things and you may never get it.
Thank you. Staff is listening. Very good.
That's
Thank
the
you.
issue there.
Yes, Chair House, we already had an agreement with members of the association. We met with them that we would treat the short sales as an expedited CIR with a letter from the bank. So we have an administrative adjustment for that issue.
All right, good.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, John Perkins, followed by Margie Znaga. I'm trying. And, okay, well, we'll see. Yes.
Well, thank you, Mayor and members of the council. I think everybody here with SBAOR has given, their thoughts, and I support the feedback that they've given so far. I don't need to restate everything they have. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. And then, Margie, did you want to speak? Yes.
I believe that everyone has represented my feelings with regards to the zoning ordinance and the real estate for sale signs. Thank you.
Great job, everyone. Stacy Kaplan, followed by Michael Humphrey. And Michael will be our last speaker.
Good afternoon. My name is Stacy Kaplan. I'm a member of the Association of Realtors and also a board member, and I thank you for listening to my comments. First of all, I wanted to say I support making the ZARs optional for condos for the same reasons that have been stated before me. I would also like to add that during the transaction, the seller is required to fill out a transfer disclosure statement as well as a seller property questionnaire, both of which require them to disclose whether any alterations or modifications have been made to the property and whether those have been made with or without permits. So again, that would be a flag to a buyer to request a zoning report if they so desired on a condo, if that were to come up. But as it's been stated, they're generally very uniform and also already policed by the Homeowners Association. Secondly, I wanted to say with regard to the ordering of the reports, I oppose the use of the word executed sale versus closed sale. Also with regards to our California contracts, California Association of Realtor contracts that we use state that the seller must disclose within 7 days to provide those disclosures to a buyer. So again, the 5 days even fall short of that. And I'd also like to say that in general, the contract defaults to 17 days for contingencies, and no buyer will release a contingency without having read that zoning report. So again, putting it at the beginning of the transaction before we know if you really have a consummated deal with all the reports doesn't make sense. It's an unnecessary expense for the seller.
Okay.
With regard to the open house signs, I just wanted to mention 3 is unrealistic. I would say 6 or 7 would be more realistic, considering that 1 has to be in front of the subject property. Considering our one-way streets downtown and the topography of the Riviera, Mission Canyon, often properties are several blocks away from a main artery, and you do need those directional signs to bring them, which has already been stated. Lastly, the for sale signs in the public right-of-way, I oppose that proposal. Hedges, pavement, landscaping, and properties that were built a long time ago often have been built right to the edge of the property, making it very difficult to put those in on the property. Thank you for your time.
Last speaker will be Michael Humphrey.
Good afternoon. I just heard about this issue about an hour ago. Hi. So I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to review everything. I'm not really quite sure what's being proposed, but I'm a broker and co-owner of Sterling Properties with Stacy Kaplan. We are one of the few that are launching a brand new real estate business here in Santa Barbara. In these economic times, I think it's outrageous. I oppose limitations on open house signs. We're commission-based salespeople. How many signs would you guys want if I were selling your property? Lastly, the sign in the public right-of-way, according to the NAR, Association of Realtors, 25% of buyers come off the for sale sign. I think if you do away with that, it's going to be a huge impediment in our business. Thank you.
Very much appreciated your clarity and brevity. So everyone, thank you so much for your comments. Clearly, we're going to be taking up the item number 3, is it? The number 2, I'm sorry, 2. No, we're going to, for next time, we're going to be taking up item number 2, yes, amendments to improve sign enforcement. And then, so we'll be continuing this. But let's take these a couple minutes and see if there's any comments specific from the committee on the other 4 items. Yes, Mr. Hotchkiss.
Yeah, I have a question for staff. Does enforcement require any additional personnel?
The Planning Division has staffed the enforcement program at different levels over the last many years. We've lost 2 enforcement officers, so we are down at a bare minimum of less than 1 FTE for enforcement. We're trying to, in these changes, make that 1 person or less than 1 person more effective. So that's how many enforcement staff we have now.
So is that a yes or a no? I'm confused.
It doesn't require, we'll do as much enforcement as we can with the enforcement staff we have.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Okay, good. And we're hopeful we may be able to actually get a motion today on these, but we'll see. We got a couple changes. Yes?
Thank you. I'm just going to go through the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here. First, on the sign committee reconstitution, I'm fine with the changes. I appreciate what our sign committee members were saying, and just as easy as it is today to move those forward to reduce the scope of it, it'll be just as easy should the market change to bring it back to where it was. So I don't think we need a time limit or something on the ordinance. I think it's fine what you're proposing, and if we want to bring it back, we can easily do that should the market warrant that. The number 2, I'm really glad Councilmember White's coming back next week, so I don't have to deal with that. But I do think there were some very good comments made from the public, and since I will be eventually voting on it, I'll just put out a couple things about 5 signs seems to make a lot more sense to me. It'll be interesting to see the Pump Flicks presentation, but I guess the idea is what's the intent of the sign ordinance from the walkway versus a pump that's in the middle of the property. It's not indoors because gas stations are not indoors, but if it was, this wouldn't be an issue. So I guess those are the questions that go through my mind. And balloons, there's a difference between a life-size T-Rex and a balloon. So, but good luck with that. Have fun with that. Changes, number 3 makes a lot of sense to me as well, and for good reasons. Number 4, Again, a lot of the issues I'm fine with the proposed changes. And I guess number 5, we need some more clarification on some things. And I appreciate Ms. Bradley's comments in particular about short sales and how do you put that in ordinance, or is that part of a separate document or what? And I'm not sure if we're ready to approve number 5 today, given the comments. So I'm happy to move forward. I can start. I can make a motion for items number 1, 3, and 4 to move those items to council.
Second.
Okay, I have a motion and a second. I'll just chime in on those real quickly. The reconstitution really does make sense, and I think that I really take Ms. Boucher's perspective to heart. I think we should all recognize we do have the opportunity when we are ready to do it to change it back. And staff, would you just validate that for me? There's nothing that we're doing here that would make it permanent, like forever in a day. We'd be able to come back at an appropriate time and reset it if we wish.
Yes, I think the ordinance recognizes that this is temporary in and of itself. That's why it's not even being codified. It's a separate ordinance. It won't go in the municipal code. So it's temporary.
Okay, great. The expiration of approvals, I really support that we've already had some difficulties with that. And the change of preliminary approval to project design approvals will also save some trouble. So I support it. So any other discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? So that's us. Now we've got the item on ZIR. Can you give us guidance real quickly? Is there anything that from what you've heard, that we could vote on today, or do you need to come back to us?
I'm really clear on that ordinance, and I thought I was working pretty closely with the association. We're fine with 5. We were kind of waiting for them to come back to us with 5. The ordinance now is 3. We expected to change that.
That's on the signs you're talking about right now?
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Or
the ZIRs.
I was talking about
on
the
ZIRs.
Let's focus on that.
It's really that condominiums would be optional.
Okay.
We would recommend the language we showed you on a screen that said there'd be a new exemption for new houses as well. That's not in your ordinance, but while we're here, we'd really like to make that change as well.
Doesn't that need to be noticed separately if it wasn't in the
No.
report? Okay.
No, I mean, it's going to go to City Council on an introduction,
Okay.
and it certainly is disclosed in the public hearing. The language for that final paragraph where there was question, I'd have to defer to Mr. Vinson if he has new language for you. But the condominium being optional and the new...
And the short sale, you said you have an administrative...
We had already talked about an administrative program for that right now you don't pay extra for an expedited ZIR where the escrow period is less than 14 days. We were just going to ask the agents to show us a letter from the bank, and we would treat it as expedited. Okay. So we had an administrative change for that, for this current unusual situation we're in with short sales.
Okay, but that wouldn't be part of our decision then today.
You could include that in your motion,
I think it'd be good to include it in there, to mention it.
It doesn't need to be in the ordinance.
Okay, and then what about the actual time of the ZIR being required?
Mr. Chair. Right now on page 27 of your staff report, the copy of the ordinance, under copy to buyer, where it says the 3 days prior to consummation of transfer of title. Mm-hmm. There's the timing.
I see.
So turning to page 29, the effective noncompliance, I would recommend that replacing the language to execute an agreement with the phrase to consummate the transfer of title, matching those two time frames up. In other words, you have to provide the report to the buyer at least 3 days prior to the transfer of the title. And so if it will be unlawful for an owner to transfer title without having provided that notice.
Okay, great. And you've got the change on 29. Do I have a motion that would support those things?
No, not for me. I have a question, if I could. Mr. Caldwell, if somebody is if you're about to clear a deal, and only 3 days prior to that, you get a zoning report that may be a red flag that you weren't expecting, isn't that an awful short amount of time to give that buyer?
Mr. Hotchkiss, I'll tell you what we're going to do. It's 2 o'clock. It's time for the City Council meeting to begin. We are going to be reconvening about these topics. Let's bring the ZIR back along with the regulations at the next meeting. And Mr. Limon, when do you think that would be?
I believe we checked, and it's the 26th or November 2nd.
Okay, and so do you want to say what it is right now? Or?
Would you like the 26th?
Okay, 26th is good. So we'll come back on the 26th to continue this. Ms. King, Mr. Price, we will have you on as well, and I've got the speaker slips that we'll put together and give you the time to make your presentation. Okay, with that, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.